Hello and welcome to Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where I have conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a special focus on Latin America. My guest today is Diego Caicedo, founder of Portal Finance, a fintech company based in Colombia and Chile that helps financial institutions, large companies, and their suppliers optimize invoice-backed finance. I've had the privilege to work with Diego and the Portal Finance team since they won the 2016 LATAM-wide Magma Partners FinTech competition, and we've invested in 3 rounds since. Portal Finance recently announced a new $1.5 million investment round and a $200 million partnership with BTG Pactual to help fund loans via Portal Finance. Diego is an entrepreneur who lives up to the name Crossing Borders. He was born in Popayán, Colombia, then moved to the Bay Area before kindergarten, where he lived until he was 12, before moving back to Popayán to finish school. We talk about the differences between Colombia and the US, what it was like moving to Bogota to start university as a 15-year-old, leaving university to start his business before graduating, and starting a business in the coffee industry, and how he rebounded from an early business failure. We cover his time as an entrepreneur in the mining industry and how a market crash showed him the opportunity to build credit scoring systems for businesses, which was the first iteration of Portal Finance. We also go in depth on how Portal Finance works in Latin America and how things like electronic invoicing, automated tax collection, and Social Security payments are more advanced in Latin America than they are in the US market. We also talk about Diego's advice for other entrepreneurs who are just getting started. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Diego Caicedo from Portal Finance. Hello, Diego. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Nate. Great to finally make it.
Yeah, so thanks for being willing to do it. Where are you in the world today?
So we're currently at our offices here in Bogota, Colombia, where we're headquartered.
So can you give me just a little overview on what Portal Finance does?
So Portal Finance does supplier financing. We focus on small and medium enterprises getting their money today instead of having to wait the net 90, net 120 they usually have to do, and solving their mission critical capital.
So for people outside of Latin America, invoice financing may not be super familiar. Can you give just a picture of how that works in Latin America?
So what you usually have, not only in Latam but all across the world, is if you're a supplier to a big corporation, they'll usually pay you 90 days, 120 days after you've submitted your invoice. So what we do is we grab that invoice and we'll discount it and provide the money up front, usually in the same day and under an hour, to the supplier because he needs the money. He can't get financing for those and hold on to 90 days without us.
And why in Latin America is this such a big problem compared to, say, the US?
So I think the problems generalize and it's all over the world. But over here we have a much more conservative banking system that will not lend money to companies after the 2008 financial crisis. So this has made it just really bad if you're a business owner and you want to get traditional credit and stuff. It's basically out of your reach unless you're already wealthy. Like the joke here is banks will only lend money to those who don't need money.
And what about payment terms and interest rates on other types of loans?
So it's basically prohibitive because any other type of loan is going to be super high risk. So you're going to get charged stuff in the 30 to 40% range.
Yeah, that's really high compared to maybe a business loan in the US might be as low as 8% or even 15 if you're unlucky.
Exactly. But over here, you're looking at high 30s if you're lucky to even get it.
Yeah, I've had similar issues with my businesses in LATAM, even with secured loans, like loans off of property in a business. People were offering 25%. And I just jokingly said, well, I'll put it on my credit card. And they didn't understand the joke because credit cards in Chile, for example, might be as much as 60%.
It's a completely different type of requirement. So, even if you look at the defaults or you look at the fundamentals of the credit, you'll say, okay, there must be a lot of defaults in this credits. that's not even true. Like defaults are super low compared to the United States and everything. It's just that the market is super conservative, and they just want to steer away from giving you any type of exposure to you.
So we're going to jump into Portal Finance more a little bit later, but I wanted to talk about your background. So where were you born?
So I was born in a small city in the southern Colombia called Popayán. I was born there, but my dad had been living in the U.S. for most of his adult life. So we migrated to the U.S. When I was 3, and I grew up in the East Bay area until I was 12. So I was basically raised in and around San Francisco for most of my childhood. I then came back to Colombia. We came back. I graduated from my university actually in Popayán, and then came to school in Bogota, where I started my university.
And what was it like going back from the US to Colombia as a 12-year-old?
It's a major cultural shock. So, especially in a small town like Popayán, it was a very, very confusing time because my Spanish was not my first language, so it made everything much harder, uh, and it was just weird. All over the cultural differences, people uh, were much more open to like, let's go out, let's go dancing. When you're a 13-year-old, it's like, what's going on? What's all this? In the U.S., this would have never happened. So it was a very interesting time to be a young guy.
And what was it like in terms of schooling? What were some of the differences from the school you were in the US versus what you came back to in Colombia?
So I have to say, we were lucky. We were in a great district in the U.S., so we had like a really good school. But once you get over here, the level of intensity is so much higher. Like the academic requisites for our day to day were a lot higher, a lot more difficult. You had to immediately up your game to catch up with everything, and a lot of focus on history, a lot of focus on world geography and stuff like this. So it was much more broader view than what we had in the U.S., where we would basically just do U.S. history and stuff like that.
What about in math and language skills? Were there many differences, or was it mostly in history and
So
economy?
I like mostly I didn't get to do like the high math cycle in the U.S. So because I left before that. But yeah, it's definitely, I would say most of our high school math is college grade here in Colombia. We have a really good educational system. My school was super aggressive in terms of getting you like to tier one math, physics, calculus, and all this stuff before we graduated. So it was great prepping for the university and taking an engineering course and stuff like that.
And in Colombia, people generally graduate high school at 17, right?
I graduated at 15, so I was always the youngest guy in the class. I skipped a class. I was basically accelerated a couple of courses in the U.S. So I graduated and I started my university when I was 15, which was very weird because everybody around you was in the 18s, had IDs to go out, and you had to look around and you're like, oops. So a lot of looking. I've always looked older than I am, so that's always been easy for me. Like I was basically a 15-year-old, and I would go into any bar and never get carded and stuff like that. It was super fun.
And you went to university in a different town.
Yeah, I came to Bogota. So Bogota is the capital city. I was able to come into one of the biggest universities here, Universidad de los Andes, which is the top university for engineering and business. So I was in economy and industrial engineering major, double major.
Did you did you always know that you were going to start businesses, or was that something that came later?
So I was always super curious and doing a lot of stuff on the side. So I started back in the day. We brought our computers from the U.S. and everything. So we would start in a couple of not so legit businesses. So basically, like music stuff, engineering software that my dad's friends needed. So we would crack them and get them on their computers when I was a 13-year-old. So that was my first business to pay for a lot of the fun stuff we did. Then I started to do a little bit of developing. I did a couple of of software endeavors. I really always been a techie since I was young. So a lot of that was my dad pushing me towards the computer, and he knew that was the future.
So when you graduated university, what did you do next?
So the real thing, I didn't graduate. I dropped out when I was missing 2 semesters to graduate. My dad was getting to that stage where they wanted to do something philanthropic with his friends from the U.S. So they wanted to set up a foundation to do coffee to support coffee growers in close to our hometown Popayán. And we had a very heated discussion one summer in California, where I was telling them I was a very uh, we would say altanero. I did not respect the authority that much. So we were having this discussion with his friends. His friends were all ex-entrepreneurs. They had done great things in the valley and around San Francisco. And I'm like, don't give away stuff. Like that's exactly what has us in this position. You like they have a really good crop. They're just screwed by the markets. The markets value their coffee at $1 a pound, while we buy it at Walmart at $7 or $8 a pound. You need to vertically integrate the chain, and I had this whole economic theory of why that was coming from my teachers. They said, if you're such a smartass, why don't you do it? I'm like, what do you mean? Well, show us that there's a better way of doing this. And I come back after a couple months in the U.S., back down to university. I'm like, okay, there's something here. Like, let me investigate this. I go to one of my professors and I tell them, hey, I really want to take a swing at this. I think it's a great business. More than a great business, I have a lot of support. I'm going to get exposure to the U.S. Ecosystem. Can I do this? And they're like, oh, but you're only two semesters away. How are you going to do this? I'm like, but I'm 22 years old. There's really not that much stuff that I can't. If this fails, I can always come back to university and stuff like that. So since I was a double major, I went then to my economics director, and he's like, leave. You're 22. If you fail, you're going to come back at what, 24, 25? Like, you're still going to be the youngest guy in most of our classes. Like, these opportunities, take them. So we took that. I took the leap. Everybody almost had a heart attack in my house. So my dad, my mom, everybody was like, oh my God, after so much effort and everything, you're only 2 semesters away. Why are you doing this? So we started the business. We ran the biggest coffee venture of that time. We were talking about specialty coffee before specialty coffee was a thing. Had a great time. Then we had the La Niña, that is a weather phenomenon, basically wiped half the Colombian crop over 1 year to the next, and basically annihilated our business because we were concentrated 100% on Colombian coffee, and production went down to half. So it really shook up the industry and basically left us looking elsewhere to do stuff. So we had to close down the company. So I was 25 years old. I was like really not that sure of what I had to do with my life now. Tried to go back to university. I did it. Took about 2 weeks of classes before deciding that I was not going to do that and I was going to find something else to do.
What did you learn during those first 3 years with the coffee business?
A lot. I was like being super naive, and in business lets you get taken advantage quite often. Like the idealism of running a business is nothing close to the reality. Business is tough, and people are they're always going to look for their own interests. Nobody's going to say, oh, this is the fair thing to do. It's very weird in the business acumen. You have to be really protective of your stuff. You have to hire the people that generate the revenue first and focus on revenue generation before anything else. That was, I think, our biggest thing was we were focused too much on the grandiose idea of entrepreneurship and not on doing the business. So it was really like businesses live and die on cash flow. If you don't generate money, it's great, but it's not the type of business we want to be in because you're always in a very delicate position when you rely 100% on outside capital, 100% on different things in the market that aren't your business acumen.
In Latin America, fear of failure is one of the biggest impediments to people starting business and even investing in businesses. And you had a company that didn't work when you were 25, your first one. How did that feel, and how did you think about that back then?
So a lot of people, when you fail a business, they'll come at you and they'll try to mark you for life. It took me about 6 weeks to like get even out of my apartment because I was like, oh my god, I failed. And the friend came to me and gave me like one of the wisest words I've ever, I think. And he said, look, companies are like your best friends. You take them all the way to the grave, but you never put yourself in the same hole as the company. You're young, you're gonna fail a lot more, and if you don't do that, you're just resigning to your dreams. So get off your ass and go do something else. And that was like so telling. Like people would say, "Oh, but I'm like we're in business. Like I'm looking for a new business. We're restarting. We're doing something new." And people were like, "Why? Because you failed. You should just go get a job and do what everything." I'm like, "No, why? I had the best university of my life. I did business. I learned from a lot of stuff that you should and shouldn't do." And I think there's a lot of value to that.
And how did the person that gave you that advice, how do you think that they came up with that, especially being in the culture?
So first, he wasn't in the culture. So this is one of my dad's friends. He had done had been an entrepreneur for 40 years. He had started dozens of businesses in California. He had done crazy stuff from insurance companies to banks to stuff. So he really said, like, look, it took me 7 tries to get my first real business to the point. Who said you were going to make it on the first one?
So hopefully people listen to this and get that same advice passed on. I think that's one of the biggest cultural changes that needs to happen, and I think already is starting to happen in Latin America.
Yeah, it's also a lot of like losing. People here are way too dependent on the way, like we say, losing face, and they think that failure is a way of losing face with the society, family, with everybody around them. And I think that's just a way of saying you're scared to take a risk, and you're one of the few ones that are actually taking a risk. That should be applauded by society.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, it's funny. So in our first fund with Magma, we call it a fund, even though it was just Francisco, me, and Diego when we started, and most of the money came from Francisco. And we talked about whether we should raise money from other family offices when we got started, and we didn't do it for two reasons. One was we thought that if we were going to take risks, we should do it ourselves before asking other people for it. So we had skin in the game. But the second one was from Francisco's side, and he doesn't really buy into the fear of failure narrative, but he didn't want to take outside money before it was something proven, because he didn't want people to come and basically say passive aggressive things if something failed. Just didn't want to deal with it. So we ended up doing it ourselves to start.
It's exactly. It's again, that's very Latin. I'd say the Catholic influence of the guilt and the shame play a lot into our culture. Uh, and I think it's one of the things that holds us back as a society even more, because people are afraid of doing big things, because when you do big things, you take big risk, with and that's 90% of this stuff is going to fail. You know that better than I do.
So after getting over the first business not working, what did you do next?
So I had learned to do fundraising. I learned to go to do a lot of project finance, the structured stuff from the coffee days, and I also learned to work in parts of Colombia that a lot of people didn't want to work. So right there at that time, there was this new thing that was mining coming into the country. Commodity prices were shooting through the roof. Everybody was talking about mining, and I'm like, okay. And I met a guy. He was in his 90s, a Texan that had been. He was a World War II veteran, very particular fellow, John Miller. So this guy had been here in Colombia since the 60s, and he had a mining property in northern Colombia. Great mining property, but nobody wanted to pay attention to the gringo. So I came up, we struck a really good relationship, and he's like, "Hey, I know there's a lot of value in my asset. Can you help me sell the asset?" So I'm like, "Yeah, let me just look at it and try to learn something about mining, try to understand this." My dad was an engineer, so I had a lot of that background of understanding a lot of the terms and stuff. So we started working together, and once we started, we ultimately sold the property for in the tens of millions of dollars. And he was, before we got there, he was only getting maybe offers in low single digits. So it was great for him, great for us, great business. The company that bought it asked me on to take a role as director of operations. I had never run operations for a mining company. I had never run any of these things. It was a great challenge because it had to be somebody that can do the business, but it can also operate in weird parts of the country. We had a lot of security issues in these parts, but since I was accustomed to going around to the coffee fields where there were also in dangerous parts of the country, and I was like, yeah, I'll do it. I love the challenge of doing this. I brought on a Chilean as a partner to head up exploration. So I was doing operations, he was doing exploration. We did that for a year. We invested maybe 14, $15 million worth of money into that property. I took a step back and I'm like, okay, this was fun, but also living in this part of the world in very dangerous town was not that fun after a year. Like I was doing 30 days at a time in the project. So I basically took a step back. And Lucho, that was the guy I brought from Chile, says, "Hey, do you want to come on board South American Management, our company? We need a partner to help us in Colombia. We have a lot of clients that are looking to raise money, sell projects, and stuff." And I came to work with South American Management that was headquartered in Santiago of Chile. So when we started there, we started working with big companies. So we had clients like Codelco, Anglo American, like tier one mining companies. And we were doing basically anything related to projects. So we were looking for projects. We would get on a truck and drive for 2 months all over the country looking for a huge new copper development. But we would also work with private equity vehicles out of Australia to try to finance and buy projects in Colombia, in Latam, all over. So it was a lot of fun. So we did that for 8 years, a long time, actually. It was a lot of fun. And we basically, commodities went bust. So then you have another second real heartbreaker. And this is where like we start looking at the reality. Like we had a good business. We had hundreds of employees and stuff like that. And our clients would used to pay us like net 10, net 5. We were really endeared to our clients because they paid us so well. And then from one moment to the other, we start getting these clients calling us and saying, "Hey, you know what? I need to pay you net 60, net 90. We're like, "Holy cow, how are we going to do this? How are we going to raise money for our business now?" I'm like, "No, this business has been around. We have a good cash flow. It's impossible. Let's go to the banks." First dose of reality when the banks start shutting the doors. I'm like, and we had everything for the banks to give us money, like the asset, the huge client base, a lot of revenue, and banks would just say, "No, we don't want anything to do with mining right now." I'm like, mining is 35% of the Chilean economy. That's the level of shut off that we got. So that's where we start like mating this story into the portal finance. And we go to the factoring companies and they're like, "Yeah, you need the money. So take 3% discount a month on the invoice." I'm like, "Why?" The guy that owes me the money is Codelco, the biggest mining company in the world. He's gonna pay you the money. He's good for it. No, it has nothing to do with him. You need the money, right? What do you mean? I mean, yes, of course I need the money. But see, take it or leave it. We're the only guys with money in town, so you take 55% annualized rate. uh, or you're out. And it was ultimately like a huge whirlwind of business that, and it was not us. Like the whole industry was coming to a realization that nobody wanted to give us money anymore. Not the banks, not the factoring companies, and we still the industry as a whole represented a third of the country. It was just incredible time, like to see from the upbeat to the downbeat how it was taken.
How quickly did that upbeat to downbeat happen?
So my partner's been in the business. He's in his late 60s, Lucho. He's he says like every 10 years there's at least one cycle to the other. But this one was especially dramatic. The upcycle was very aggressive. There was a lot of money coming in, but that also led to the down cycle being equally aggressive. So I would say from peak to peak, it was 5 to 6 years. It was super like from the days that anybody would open the door to you at any type of venue. Uh, you want money? Here, take $1 million here, take $1 million there. Mining went from doing that to not being able to basically scratch together enough to continue the projects. That's why I think the industry took such a hard hit.
And so then what happened after that?
So we had to sit down and like, okay, this is not the company is great, but we have our business depending on having enough cash flow to support operations for these mining companies. So we had to go to the mining company and say, you know what, we can't do this because we're losing money because all the money is being given to the financing companies. So guys, you know what? We're winding down this unit. My partner stayed on board, but just on a reduced, just doing reporting and a lot of the high level stuff we were doing. And I'm like, okay, another cycle, another time to take a step back and say, now what do you do with your life? Like, but it was a different condition. We had saved up. So I was like, should I go do an MBA? Should I go back to university again? A lot of these things start going through your head. Like, should I just take a couple of months off and figure out what I want to do with my life? What is going to be the next steps?
And so how did you figure out with the time off, how did you figure out it was time to do the next thing?
So, I, my biggest, my I'm restless. Like I can't stay still for very long. You know me for some time now. You know what that means. Like I always need to be occupied. So a friend of mine told me, hey, there's this company that's a venture builder based out of Miami. They're looking for somebody with finance experience that knows the market. They want to do something based out of Miami to play into Latin America. So I go to the venture builder. It's called Rocker Labs, and they hired me as a consultant to try to work out where the opportunities in the Latin market were in fintech. I'm like, fintech, this is something. At the end of the day, when you demystify the fintech, it's just like, where are the opportunities to really not even disrupt, but just improve how financial services are being deployed into Latin America. And that was a huge eye opener to understand the amount of money that was not being deployed, the amount of money that was really just sitting around. And Latin America has money. Like the amount of wealth in Latin is impressive. You go to the top family offices here and they have billions of dollars under administration. But you say there's a disconnect between that and the rest of the society. The disparity is really, really big. So we started working. I finished my consultancy with them, and we paid. They wanted to do B2C type solutions. But one of the things that really resonated in my mind was in the B2B space, not only Latin America, but the whole world is way behind on coming to solutions for B2B finance. So nowadays, you walk into a Falabella in Latin America, and you'll get a credit card before you walk out the store. They'll score you, they'll do the whole process, and you'll have a card out the door before you're out the door, just like it's been in the U.S. for ages. And a lot of that has to do with the scoring systems that are super trustworthy nowadays. So your risk score turns out a endpoint. So you have a 700. So you're worth 10 million pesos as a credit card. Done, ready. But you go as a business, and it takes 3 to 4 weeks to somebody to try to score you. And at the end of the day, it completely relates to how you relate with the bank manager. What is your level of assets as a personal, on a personal note, and not as a company? So a lot of getting a loan depends on a lot of stuff that doesn't have to do with your business, because banks and don't have a way to score your business in reality. So when you come to a loan for a bank in a bank, they'll say, "Bring me your last two balance sheets, your two P&Ls," and they'll try to put that through ratios, and they'll do ratios on your models. But at the end of the day, none of that really gives you a picture of what a company's doing. And what we saw was a huge disconnect between all these systems that were US fundamented to how you could do it in Latin America, because Latin America had this up and coming trend that was called electronic invoicing. That on its own is still not enough to be able to to make an assessment of a company. But we had a lot of other things that were still coming in play in Latin America. For example, most of our countries have centralized tax reporting systems. So you have a centralized system where you report your sales every month or every 2 months, and you have another system where where you have to pay all of your social security expenses month to month based on how many employees you have, what you pay them. So we started to look at all this information that was available, and we said, look, there's a treasure trove of information. This information is much better at understanding how a business operates at its core. A business is just the amount of value I generate. I purchase, I transform, and I sell. That's the basics of a business. Any type of business. If you're not doing these three things right, you don't have a good business. But these three things, we were able to price them accordingly with this information. So our thesis was, hey, we must be able to do a better risk assessment based on this information. So again, a little bit of the naive, it's like everybody should see this. So we went to a couple of the big financing institutions, and the first things they said was like, "And how much money has been lent out on this thesis? How many transactions have you got? Give me your default rates. Give me your expected loss. Give me a whole lot of stuff." And we're like, "Uh-oh, finance is a much harder part to do in a new company because it's a real business. There's a lot of money at stake here." So we actually had to tone it back down and say, okay, how do we know what the end goal is? How do we get there? So we started to go on this crazy route. The first one was we needed data. So we created an API that did risk analysis on invoices, because we needed a lot of invoices to be able to understand what data was available. So we partnered with an electronic invoicing company and scored 150 million invoices. After this, after getting an understanding, we found that the invoices were not enough to do an assessment, but when you put it all together, it was more than enough to do an assessment. So we then went to the factoring companies and traditional finance institutions and said, hey, there's a way of, if you give us the ability to score your clients, we're going to be able to automate the process and change how you do your business. And this was something that really has a lot of detractors in traditional finance, because the most common response is, look, we've been doing this like this for 20 years. We've made incredible amount of money. Why do I need to change it? What need do I have if I'm an established player to change the way I operate? That was the base. Like, we started to hear that a lot from a lot of industry players. So we were able to partner up, deploy this into various factoring companies that said, okay, there's something to do here. And when we started to look at them and we said, hey, why aren't you using the data? Like, the data is there, it's super powerful. That's because it really depends on what the credit executive thinks. I'm like, oh my God. This is like, even though they say they want to change, even though they say they want to transform their businesses and bring them in the 21st century, they still don't want to do this at their core. So it was another moment where we took a step back, and actually at that time we were starting to work together with Magma, and Francisco, that is one of the Magma partners, says, "Hey, do you want to meet this guy from BTG Pactual?" BTG Pactual in Latin America is basically the Merrill Lynch of Latin America. They are one of the biggest investment banks. They do asset management, a lot of structured finance. They're huge. The head of and Francisco says the head of alternative assets is a super interesting guy. You should go down and talk to him and see what you're doing. So I still remember coming into the office. This is like, we had been around a lot of offices in Chile, but you get a lot of idea of where you are when you go into a boardroom. That the technology at the boardroom is more than what you spend a month on the whole team. It was really impressive. Like, okay, these guys like technology. This is good. So we start talking with Nicolas, the head of assets, and Nico comes to us and says, "You know what? I've been doing this for a lot of years. Your story makes sense, but I still don't believe you." So we'll do a trial run, we'll do a pilot program, just because you're very well referenced into this business. We came in through one of the partners that was an investor, so it may he'll take a chance with us. So that's how we got started onto our new strategy that was going direct and providing the financing directly through an asset manager.
I remember still Francisco telling me about the meeting where he basically felt like they took the meeting because they had a good recommendation from someone who was an investor in one of their funds, but just basically out of courtesy. And so seeing how that changed through the course of a meeting is really interesting, because a lot of times when you come into a big business, they're not really wanting to change. They're taking the meeting because they feel like they need to. And it's very rare that you actually get out the other end with someone saying, "Yep, let's do a pilot."
Yeah, and I think it was a lot of the serendipity in these things. Like, you had somebody with a lot that was young, but that had been in the industry for a lot of years. That was Nicolas, that had been toying around and had been working with a lot of these factoring companies and saying, "Hey, there's a lot of room for improvement. How do we do this? How do we improve on the model?" And when we basically, we still joke about it. It was like, he comes to me and says, "That's exactly what I've been thinking we should do. Is this real? Can you really do this?" And I'm like, "We can. We're not doing it, but we can put together a pilot program. Like, we'll do the heavy lifting. Just give it a try. Like, just let us trial run the system with one client, with one big corporate, and we'll show you that how valuable it is."
So you mentioned three things when you were talking about the Latin America invoice system, and I want to just dig a little deeper into them. So the three things were electronic invoices and a centralized tax authority, and the Social Security payments. So this is, for me, is super interesting because it's one of the areas where Latin America is, or many Latin American countries are much more advanced than the US. So can you talk a little bit about how each one of those works and why it's important for the business?
Perfect. So electronic invoicing is something that started actually in Chile for Latin America. Chile was a pioneer in this. And it states that we had to have a standard invoice in an XML format that could be processed at scale. So every invoice you issue or receive had to have an exact format of an XML that you can process via computers. So this allowed you to understand not just what the bank movement was, but actually what it was for. So you would have line item descriptions, you would know what the terms of the invoice were, you would know what it implied. So it gives you a vision for us. What we saw there is how to interpret how the company makes money and how the company spends the money. And you can today with the machine learning algorithms, you're able to classify the expenses. So you can basically build up a real-time profit and loss scheme for a company because you know exactly what it's buying, how it's transforming it, and what it's selling it for. So you understand which companies are making margin because like at basics, the margin, if you have a good margin in your business, your unit economics are there, you're going to have a good business. If you don't have a good unit economics, you're losing money on every sale. It's going to be really tough to build up a business over time. So that was like the first big thing. The second thing is we work on centralized sales taxes down in Latin America. So your value added tax, your VAT, is dependent on how much you buy versus how much you sell. So that was a very good contrasting point for this because we basically had nobody wants to pay more taxes than they have to. Nobody wants to do anything that they don't have to pay. So people will be reporting exactly what they have in their tax schedule. So, and they have to report this every month, which provided a second point of contrasting the information because if you had the detailed invoices on one end, and then you had this second source of information that was telling you which invoices were actually paid, which invoices weren't, and gave you this checks and balances theory around the economics. And you had a whole lot of other taxes that were in the system. So you had taxes that were your yearly taxes that you pay on your balance sheet. So you had to declare how much assets you had on the company. Again, nobody wants to pay more taxes than they have to. So everybody would declare the reality. Nobody would inflate these balance sheets because nobody wanted to pay more taxes than they had to. So it gave us a good idea of what the asset base was, of where the company was in terms of that. And the third one is this is like something very different from the US. So everybody in Latin America is on a social security system where everybody gets health, pension, unemployment, and by obligation paid by their employer. So it's not optional. 100% of your employees have to have it. So, and this opened up a whole lot of opportunities because you have to declare what you're paying your employees. You can't underdeclare the amount that you pay the employees because then these tax authorities will really go after you. So you know what they're paying their employees. You know how many employees they're hiring, how many they're firing, if they've had work accidents, if they have, for example, commissions. So we're able to understand as part of the sales team who's getting better commissions just from their tax reporting. So if there's commissions, you know if there's commissions, there's sales, and it makes another data point to make sense of all this. So we basically were able to reconstruct how the company moved and flowed. But the other big opportunity that Social Security opened up for us is if you're a big company, a big corporation, and you have a typical company of ours has 3,000, 4,000 suppliers that they deal with every month. They have to go in and check that all of their suppliers are also paying their Social Security taxes. This is an incredible amount of paperwork. You have to just go over 4,000 companies that work for you and make sure that they're paying every employee's not only salary but also Social Security because you're liable and you have a solidarity with the employment. So this was one of the biggest burdens in accounts payable in the market was you had to not only check that the account was right, that the purchase order and everything else you had to do with the account, but you had to go through and paper check each one of these systems. This is currently one of the biggest headaches companies have. So if you're a big corporate, you have 20, 30, 50, 100 people going over somebody else's taxes to make sure that they're paying them on time. this is one of the key things we automate in Portal Finance, and we give the corporations that we work with for free access to our tools. So we have a robot that checks this and that displays every alert and makes sure that all their suppliers are up to date automatically. So nobody is actually dealing with the paperwork anymore. These are a lot of those small improvements that add up to a huge operational savings in a company.
How much time do you think a large company might save just from that one check?
So that's so the typical payment to review process in a company. So you'll get an invoice today, and you'll try to put together all the paperwork, right? And you have by law you should have all this done before the next week. You have 8 days to do this. Typically, companies will get through 50% of their workflow in those 8 days, and 50% will be left to the rest of the month. So you'll have invoices that are now have to be paid, and that you couldn't present any recourse against the invoice because they didn't pay it, and it's on you, the company, for not doing it. So it's a lot of time and money that is spent on this.
Yeah, it's a interesting system where you have three places where LATAM is much ahead of the US. You have another spot where it's very worker friendly to make sure that the workers always get their Social Security payments, and puts a bigger burden that if you don't automate it, puts a bigger burden on the employer. So it's beyond the lending. It's a very interesting piece that I think Portal Finance does well.
Yeah, and that's been the way of coming into these big corporations and saying, hey, we have this program for your suppliers. So what we'll typically do is go to a big company, construction, mining, or any other industry that is supplier heavy, and go in and say, hey, this is your current operational burden. Let us automate this, and by automating this, we get we won't charge you anything, but we'll come in and finance your suppliers cheaper, faster, and without any hidden fees or stuff that will stick up your suppliers. We'll give them the money they need to comply, and we'll automate this completely. So we have a lot of companies coming on board and thousands of suppliers coming on board because of this.
And so let's talk about how you built the business. So you talked about in one of the big lessons from the coffee business was finding a business that does revenue quickly because you don't want to depend on third parties for capital. How did you take that lesson into Portal Finance, and how did you think about raising money?
So for us, it was a mix. First, we knew we weren't going to raise outside capital until we were at a stage where it made sense, and that we had basically some type of a vision, a clear vision into how to grow this and make this a venture-worthy business. So we started out by going to the primary source of funding for a company, its clients. So one of the things is if you have something of value, somebody will pay for it. You just have to find the right person that is willing to take a risk and pay for the value you're giving them. So that's how we started. We started building our clients practically from the first day, and we saw that there were a lot of little side hustles and services that we can provide and that have now become core parts of the system. So one of the first things we built was an analytics platform to try to make sense of the information. And we started to analyze clients' information and financial institutions and tell them, hey, this is where the opportunities are. It's not about the billion invoices. It's about the 10 invoices that are worth it and that really matter. So we would charge companies for analytics. And a lot of this analytics was me sitting around learning how to do analytics and creating really nice dashboards for the clients that had a lot of value for them. And you would see that, okay, every time we sold a client an analytics screen, we would get another month or 2 months of runway. So we would go through the process. And once we started to build up and we said, okay, next stage is we need bigger clients. We need clients that are willing to go beyond the 10, 20K check, which is not a small check, I agree, for a startup that was coming in the first couple of months in business. So we started to build up steam by also trying to figure out how a client will pay for the development that we needed to do. So we knew that the system we wanted, and the clients already knew us because they had our analytics, and we told them, hey, let us build a platform that did another part of the platform. For example, uh, the connectors to the Previ Red, that is the Chilean system. So we went to a company and said, hey, we can automate this for you, but you need to pay for the development yourself because we don't have money to do this. We'll do the whole work and everything, but pay for the development. So we got a client to get his first license, and with the money we got from the first license, we developed another module of the system, and we eventually started to get a feeling for that, and then that's when we started working together, Nate. Is when we were doing the first deals and we were starting to get this cash flow. We knew that it was a huge endeavor to build everything that we had in the vision, but we knew we could piece it together organically. We knew we could start growing it eventually into what we wanted. But it also came to a moment where we said, okay, this is the moment where we take a decision if we want to accelerate growth and start doing it much faster. And that's when we started to look for outside capital because it was terms of accelerating the growth. The vision was there. We had to just nail the accelerator on it and say, let's go. We're generating enough revenue. Now we need a little bit of outside capital because we needed to go from 4 guys in a closet that we were at that time to 7 guys in a closet. That was the next step. And that's how we eventually started to build it up. And as soon as we started to make sense of the growth strategy, and every milestone came with a different request for capital because our clients would pressure us and say, okay, we'll give you this amount of capital, this amount of contracts, but you have to build it, you have to do this, you have to do the other thing. And that was a lot of how we are growing the business and finding great partners that support us and being able to step outside and say, okay, now we have to swing for the fences because we found something that is unique, that has a clear space in the market. And there's this great baseball analogy. I don't know who told me that when you're at bat, and you decide to go for a home run, you have to change everything about how you stand at bat. Everything has to be aligned to go big. You have to start thinking about creating a company and not only creating a business. And that was a lot of what we had to do. Like start thinking about this stuff more than just 4 guys in a closet and try to get more engineers on board. Because how to get a sales team put together, how to build a company that would grow as fast. Like a year ago, we were 4 guys. Now we're going on 60. So a lot of this stuff had to make a lot of sense to everybody.
So when you started to go out into the market to look for funds and to look for someone to give you those funds, how did you think about it in terms of the amount of money and the type of partner that you wanted?
So the first thing that was super clear for us is we needed somebody to add value. We needed somebody more than just the money. There's everybody always says, no, don't go for the dumb money. There's a lot of dumb money around in terms of just capital, bare capital. Uh, we knew we needed the networks because a lot of how LATAM also operates is based on where your networks are and how your networks behave from your investor and all this stuff. So we knew we wanted somebody that was well connected, that had a lot of network in the countries we wanted to operate. That was the first thing we were looking for in terms of value. The second thing was getting somebody that was actually a sounding board because this is a lonely road. Like you need somebody to sound off with and somebody to bounce ideas off that can provide you fresh eyes. One of the most dangerous things I think as an entrepreneur is you're so focused on the day to day, on getting the same next milestone, getting to the next point, that you sometimes you don't look up and say, "Am I actually going down the right path, or do I have to do a 5 degree course correction to actually take me to a path of less resistance that is going to be more profitable, that is going to make more sense?" So for me, those were like two big things. In terms of how much capital we we needed, we've always taken an approach that is the least amount of capital at each phase that will take us to the next milestone. Because I think also having too much capital at disposal in the early stages will make you lose focus in a lot. Because everything becomes really shiny if you have money. I learned this from my mining days. Like we had a lot of disposable capital. Like you would do a lot of stuff that was not the most efficient way of doing it just because you had disposable capital. And you weren't going to build a company that was going to be actually profitable and actually make sense unless you were very controlled about how you did this. So we've tried to raise the amount that our projections, like this is the next milestone. How do we get to the next inflection point in the company? How do we get to the next point where we are no longer worth one, but 10x one, and so forth. So that's how we've taken the approach to fundraising. Uh, and it's played out like if there's need for capital, there will be capital. If you don't need it, why raise it? Like there's a lot of lessons around where raising too much capital is shooting yourself in the foot.
What advice would you give to other entrepreneurs when thinking about raising capital, especially Latin American entrepreneurs that maybe are trying to raise capital either in LATAM or the US?
So the first thing is like I think if you're in LATAM, the set of rules that apply for your capital are different than the stories and what you get in the US. You need real numbers in LATAM to be able to hit your marks. So it makes it very, very difficult to do it if you're not focused on the revenue generation or whatever your metric is that you need to do. Uh, and you really need to be able to get to a point as an entrepreneur where you're realistic about your needs. I think this is something a lot of guys, even I think we're victims to it sometimes. It's like we could do this if we had more money. We could do this if we had X or Y amount of money. Uh, and I think that's 90% of the time that isn't true. I think it's just about the hustle. You have to, if you don't have it, you'll just have to work twice as hard to get there. But I think that's how it should be, anyways. Uh, it's nobody got into this business to make it an easy business. You need to you put in the hours, put in the time, the dedication, the sacrifice. I think it's all part of building the company. Uh, and so that is clear. Like, don't use it. Fundraising can't be an excuse to not build a company, to not build something big.
So you guys have had some success raising money and then also finding money to run through the Portal Finance system to actually be part of the product. Can you talk a little bit about some of the new stuff that's going on there?
We recently closed what's really been a great first tranche of work with BTG, where we got a new deal with BTG, where we have $200 million to be able to deploy and fund businesses. So that's the next milestone because is deploying this capital. So right now we're in the process of scaling and making sure that we can do this not only with BTG but also repeating the partnership structure in Colombia, and next year it's going to be other countries. But we basically have to focus on the next 6 months is deploying capital. This will make us a profitable company that will give us a lot of independence in terms of raising future rounds.
Can you talk a little bit about this type of a business in other regions in the world? What are some of the other companies that are doing similar things?
So there's a couple of companies in Europe. One of them comes to mind is Greensill Capital. Greensill has a similar take on the industry. They've just recently raised a $250 million round from General Atlantic at 1.6, $1.7 billion valuation. With round numbers that are really not that far away from business like ours. You have others in the UK called Market Invoice that has done really well. My favorite and one of the companies that, as a business model and as a company, I've grown to really look at is Cabbage. So Cabbage has done this like just awesome. I'm really a fan of what they're doing and everything there. They have the same